So the question was about my perspectives on the concepts of data as a human right and what is a sort of a systemic rather than individual thing that can be done for this. And I totally agree. The onus should not always be on the individual to fight a systematic inequality. So the fundamental problem here is that all of these companies are built on the currency of data. We were all given things for free, or so we thought, these apps and fun toys to play with, and we thought they were free, but they weren't free. We paid with our data, and now we realize that data is worth more than any money possible. I think heading towards decentralized data ownership, like you said, I think is a really great idea. I actually don't agree with the concept of data monetization, because that will further make the divide bigger between the haves and have-nots. Because what we will find then is those of us who are privileged enough to not sell our data will say, don't use my data. But no low-income person would deny selling their data if it would mean their family could get fed. So I think there does need to be some sort of value placed on data, but what that value should be, I don't think it should be monetary. But I wholly agree with the concepts of decentralized data ownership, and also more fundamentally, how we can think about alternatives to the current tech revenue model, which is fully based on data as currency. That's the only reason they take our data from us, because without it, they have nothing.
Thank you. Yeah, did either of you have an answer for that as well that you'd like to touch on?
No, I think you said it perfectly.
Great. We'll move on to the next question over here.
For Samantha, and thank you all, ladies. It's amazing to listen to a tech panel of 3 women. Very inspiring. Just circling back to what you said you would answer, I want to know what technologies you recommend buying into and what technologies we should stop using.
Yeah, so I think any technology right now that you're using and you're not paying for, if it's not exceptionally clear in the terms of use that no one ever reads, if you're not paying, then you are the actual product or service, right? The monetization is through collecting your data because you're using that product for free. So look at all of the apps and services on your phone. Also know that they collect beyond just data you're inputting, all the metadata that's about when you're using it, the types of actions you're using, your motions when using the data. There's all sorts of things being collected. So that's critical to think about, and then decide which of those services you still want to use. When we think about decentralization and decentralized data, we have to remember that that stuff's still really early. So if you can afford it, pay for services that you want to use, and make sure that, therefore, that by paying for them, you have rights to that data ownership. If you're an investor and you have capital to deploy, which by deploying capital, you're making a statement saying, I believe this technology should exist and I want it to create returns for me, I would place bets on technologies that are increasing control over data and its ownership.
So I think Samantha and I were going to be in wild agreement about everything we all have to say. But I wanted to add that often there's sort of a misunderstanding of what it means to share data. And I realize this actually talking to non-tech folks. People think of sharing data as like kind of the old days of, oh, I give my email address to get 15% off, and now you're occasionally going to send me spammy emails, right? But this is deeper, much, much deeper than that. And you touch on when we talk about metadata. You're providing things like your location. You're like, oh, well, why would my location matter? Why would the number of steps I take per day matter? So even like the minutia of data, it's not, so a lot of people talk about data as the new oil. I actually don't think it's the new oil. It's more like the periodic table, right? So oil has fixed outputs. Like you can make n number of things with oil. Data, it's more like literally the periodic table. You can make something as innocuous as water by combining hydrogen and oxygen, or you can make a nuclear weapon, and they both have the same base thing of hydrogen, right? So it's more like we have disparate things that we send that in and of itself don't seem to matter, but when combined with other things creatively, create something either immensely good or very, very horrible, but it's the same base thing. So there's that level of education that I think people should understand about what they're sharing and how they're picking up things.
There's another point I'd like to add to the question, what technology or apps should we be wary of using? And there's a trend or a type of research that has been done a lot recently, which is sometimes called dopamine hacking. And that is that we have gotten really good with technology at figuring out what will trigger certain responses in your brain. And one example for this is mobile games like Candy Crush, for example, which have been compared to digital crack or digital heroin by some people, because they have gotten really good at triggering those reward loops in your brain, get you hooked on just playing more and more, doing more microtransaction or shopping apps. Certain types of these shopping apps are also really good at making you spend $1 here and there, giving you special bonuses and rewards and so on. So this is something that we should all be wary of when we use something, especially when we compulsively check an app. It's pretty likely that they have done some reward hacking in the background to trigger our neural circuits to get addicted to those apps.
Yeah, and you'll see a movement now increasingly of technologists who are perhaps feeling guilt for the things they've built, knowing that they've built these things, but not at the time having understood the repercussions. And so you see new things coming up like syndicates of early technologists who've had great exits who are saying, okay, we're starting funds to deploy our capital to counter these effects. You see new things like time well spent, which actually is something that will be added to things like Instagram and Facebook, or hopefully other technologies as well, to show you sort of like on a nutritional wrapper, like how much you're using and if it's too much and if it's negatively impacting your health.
That's right. There's also the Foresight Pledge by Foresight Institute, which is akin to a Hippocratic oath for engineers and scientists in tech in Silicon Valley to think about the impact of what they're building, and that those do no harm and improve the state of the world.
One very easy thing you can do, by the way, to break that dopamine cycle is turn off your notifications from your social media, so you'll only see it when you go on it, and you will actually just go on it less.
You can also change your phone to black and white, and that will make it less rewarding.
Yeah. One more thing I'd like to add, just more concretely about technologies you're using and how we're building them. So if we think of, okay, there's decentralization, and this is one promising technology to change the paradigm. Another thing that exists in terms of encryption is homomorphic encryption. So there's all sorts of different types of encryption you can use. There's you should look at the different types of encryption being used on products you're using and ask yourself, will this encryption protect me or will it not? And if you're really an encryption nerd, we can talk later about how you build and dive into those and which ones are best for you.
Yeah, a question in the back.
Hi, thanks for some very interesting both talks and reflections afterwards. I got to say, multiple part question, because the approach you three guys have is very important. But what's your feeling about in 2018 where we are now? If people can use these types of input and reflections, can they actually do something with it, or is it more into the sort of falling rocks category of advice? And if so, what should be the next steps to take?
I'm happy to kick that off. I mean, so the greatest thing for part of it's political, right? Like you have to band together and demand a change. Yeah. So I think that's where it starts. If you're thinking about what can I do as an individual on a grassroots level, there's a huge power historically to collective bargaining. So if all of you in this room got together and found 10 people and told them about what you heard today, and they found 10 more people, and all of a sudden you have a substantial amount of people who are collectively saying we want to do something about this, you have collective bargaining power. You can go to people using your data, and it wouldn't matter if one of you went up to them and said, hey, you're using my data, I want to send you a cease and desist because I don't agree to the way you're interpreting such a business-friendly use case of it for my consumer protections. But if 2 million of you go and say this to CVS or Walgreens or to anyone using your data, all of a sudden there's a really big problem. They have to respond, and they have to respond in a more consumer-friendly way. You can push for different legal interpretations. You can push for it as a human right. In your own individual use, you can decide to stop using these products as much, which, as we've seen historically, causes their stock prices to tank. A few things, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll point out one thing. When Cambridge Analytica happened, those of us in the space said, why this time? Like, there was nothing new. We've been talking about this for years. So suddenly Cambridge Analytica became a thing, but it had been a thing for a very long time. So we'd been years building this up, and one might say we're already past the point of no return with all of our social media usage, how much information Facebook had about us, how little privacy we had, and yet in less than a year, we've seen sweeping change happen and across all different social medias. Now we have Jack Dorsey trying to go on an apology tour, Mark Zuckerberg going up in front of Congress. So it is certainly possible they're not behemoths that are unbreakable. I mean, most of these companies are actually not very old. We've just become very, very accustomed to their existence.
I have a quick question, and then we'll move to these two. We've been touching a lot on the darker sides of data, but as a humanitarian, something I've thought a lot about is how we can use data for good, and how all of this data that we have collected could be harnessed into new applications, new products. I'd be interested to hear your insights on those applications as well.
So there's a, oh, so you want to go ahead? I was going to say, there's a really popular tweet going around now, and it's apparently written by somebody who was born in 1981, which is sad because that's around my age. And it says something like, you know, we dated without Tinder, and we talked to people without Twitter, and we got places without Uber, and blah, blah, blah. But then all the responses have been, yeah, but we did it so inefficiently, right? I mean, yes, Google and Amazon and Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, they take our data and they're not doing necessarily good things with it. But what we do know is that I can look up any fact and I can know a correct answer to it if I am diligent and good about how I Google things. I am able to call a cab and get somewhere, you know, and not worry about payment much easier than I previously did. I'm able to connect with my family members all around the world. It was recently Eid, which is a Muslim holiday. I got to chat with my cousins in Bangladesh, right, for free, by the way, because of Voice over IP and because of Facebook Messenger, and I got to see my recently born nephews. These are all things we didn't have before. So it is certainly possible, but then the question is, we need to harness the good and augment the good. And I really love something that actually you had said about basically about redistribution, about how we have people with skills being replaced and the people who own sort of accumulating the ownership. I think there's something critical here about positive redistribution to solve a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and I agree that social media and all these data applications are not all bad. It depends on how we use it and what we decide to put on there and whatnot. Something I'm really excited about in terms of technology for our future are the applications where we might not be smart enough to solve them by ourselves. So for example, in medical research, some statistic I've read a couple of years ago is that a doctor who wants to stay up to date with his field, with all the research that comes out, would need to read one paper every hour of every day, the entire year. And of course, nobody can do that, and nobody has the capacity to do that. But a machine can. So a machine can read at a much faster pace, can store information at a much more scalable way, can find all the crosslinks and compute the data. So there are already approaches in research where we use artificial intelligence to come up with new research hypotheses, and there are labs where we can test new molecules for drugs, for example, with the help of new technology. And I think it's very exciting that we're getting to this point where we can surpass human intelligence and human memory in terms of solving problems with artificial intelligence and technology.
Thank you.
I want to add to that actually quickly, which is to say that in the same way that we design a lot of these technologies in addictive ways that are harmful to people, you can actually use big data and behavioral psychology to build technologies that have really positive outcomes. So one of my favorite examples is O-Power. So O-Power isn't a utility company. They design statements of electrical use for utility companies. And what they do is they collect consumer data and they tell you relative to your neighbors how much electricity you're consuming. And it's been one of the best use cases for reducing electrical consumption, because our psychology is that we feel selfish if we have such a great gain compared to, or consumption great to relative to our neighbors, right? So that's a really positive use case. I think as long as you preserve privacy, you're able to actually do a ton of amazing things with big data while revealing insights. A wise friend actually pointed out to me recently that in the United States, CEOs make 350 times the average rate of a worker, whereas in a place like Norway, it's 10 times. So I think if that information was readily available and transparent without revealing who the individuals precisely were, that could also allow us to do some collective bargaining. In terms of the ways we design technology, one great encryption technology is called zero-knowledge proof. And one reductionist viewpoint of what this does is it allows you to have massive amounts of data and really personalized data for people without revealing who the individual is or the underlying data set. So in the centralized compute model today, you want to rent a car, I ask for your driver's license, I now, as the rental car agency, hold all of your personal information. There's no need for that. Instead, with zero-knowledge proof, you could have in a self-sovereign ID or elsewhere that data, and I would ping a server, centralized or decentralized, and be able to say, can you rent a car? Do you have the eligibility to do so? And it would just give a yes or no without revealing the underlying data set. So imagine like how many social security numbers would have been hacked in the US if we had that system instead.
Awesome. I think that concludes our panel. We're unfortunately... Oh yes, we get the 2 last questions. Excellent. One back here and then over here.
It's a lot of ethical discussions coming on in the future, connected to neurobiology, biology, psychology, the emotional behavior, and these kind of things. And how do we collect the right competence to have those discussions for the future? Have you any?
Do you
what kind of competences will you?
Do you mean the right competence as human beings to understand the technologies,
No,
or
to raise the ethical discussions?
the competence to raise? So, sorry, I'm not following.
I think it's like 4 or 5 different challenges that artificial intelligence are putting onto our society. It's like how do we manage disruptions and innovation? How do we manage the diversity, inclusion, and equality? How do we manage trust, as you have more or less acted upon today, or answered a little bit upon today? How do we manage that relationships is the most important, our quality of relationships is the most important driver for being happy. How do we manage that with artificial intelligence? I mean, these kind of questions, it raises a lot of different aspects than the computer science and the IT discussions or tech discussions. It's about humans and other kind of competencies.
I think you're... Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your question. As a really quick note, if you Google ethical issues in AI, the number 1 result is an article I wrote on exactly these questions. And you asked which skills we need or what we need to address them. And I think that we need more now than before kind of awareness of them and engagement in this public conversation. So I'm not a policy person by heart. I studied neuroscience in college and then went into artificial intelligence. And yet I got involved with the World Economic Forum to work on these issues related to artificial intelligence, not because I love policy, but because it just needs to be done, and these questions can't just be answered by the engineers who, just work in their offices and just figure it all out without having this global conversation. So I think one really important thing that we need was actually being done here in Oslo today is to get people together from different fields, from different aspects of decision making, and get them to talk to each other to figure these things out, because there's no base truth that we can all just rely on. It just hasn't been done before. So we're the ones who need to figure it out. There's no cavalry coming, so to speak.
So I'm just going to echo what you said and add that a problem with a lot of these technology companies is this was sort of an unexpected outcome of all these technologies. People were just building things to build things and didn't really think about the consequences. This is move fast and break things, right? We just built to quote unquote disrupt. And another part of it is that there is a very strong culture, particularly in Silicon Valley, of gatekeeping other people out, whether it's because of their minority status, their sexuality, their gender, or even what they studied. I am a very rare data scientist, social scientist, and I am now in demand. But when I first came into Silicon Valley, a lot of the questions were like, how do you program? You're a political scientist. Political science don't program. Actually, I do. I've been programming since I was 18. Thank you very much. Statistical programming is a thing. Right? So I probably knew programming languages better than half of these kids with computer science degrees, and yet my background was looked down on. And I was fortunately old enough and resilient enough to say, F what these guys think, right? But plenty of people are not, and frankly, you shouldn't have to overcome this hurdle to be allowed into these pearly gates, right? But it's something that the culture is now realizing, and they're not realizing out of their own sense of self-reflection. They're realizing because it's coming back to haunt them. I think a big part of it is, as you said, improving this diversity, but in like cross-cutting diversity in every sort of facet you can think of, and also at every single level you can think of.
So this is really critical, what you just said. So you're touching on signaling and how using signaling is not only denying certain people opportunities, but if we're thinking of the world in terms of algorithmic determinism, what that does is it prevents outliers. So if you're an outlier and against all odds, you didn't fit the mold and you still have become this great success, people who push us to think differently about the world, who don't fit the mold, those are many of the people who have created the greatest accomplishments we've seen, who have pushed our progress further, who have pushed the way we think, we love, we feel, the way we experience humanity. If in the future we're relying increasingly on algorithmic determinism and we're squashing outliers and being passive participants in the way things are being decided around us, then we're preventing outliers from emerging. And we need to think very thoughtfully about what kind of future that will create.
And also the opposite, also the opposite for the future, how we want to build a better future. And thinking about the health sector, at least in Norway, and I guess in all of the world, it's an increasing population, and it's increasing elderly population, and that means that really manage these kind of things, how to have relationships using artificial intelligence, where we need to have people, and how do we actually develop these kind of things in a reliable way.
Thank you for the question and the meaningful responses. We have time for one more question. No more questions. If you have any more questions, these lovely, intelligent, amazing women who we should give a round of applause to, actually.